Truth be told, I thought I might not have much to say about Ys 6 that I hadn't already covered in my Ys 5 video and others on the earlier games. If you're new to the channel, I'm playing the Ys series in order, and as a gameplay first kinda guy, well, Ark of Napishtim is more of the same. Not exactly the same, since Napishtim debuts a new gameplay engine, although not one new to me, having played both Origin and Oath of Felghana, which build on it further. Unfortunately, the fact that Ys 6 was the first in the series to use the eponymous Napishtim engine shows. Combat feels like a rougher version of what I'm familiar with from Origin or Oath. Fine enough, but it's clear the devs at Nihon Falcom hadn't perfected their new engine on the first go. Add-all controls okay, the combat plays alright, but somehow Ys 6 lacks a certain magical touch I remember from Ys 1 and 2, Origin, really all the entries except 5, but especially those three, my favorites so far. It's hard to describe, but Ys 6 feels a bit more boring and less flashy in comparison, as if it's going through the motions instead of really taking advantage of the power of the PlayStation 2. That's the version I'm playing anyway. Originally, it came out only in Japan for PC in 2003, then it got its first release over here for PS2 a few years later, before finally getting a 2015 Steam version. Now, I'd recommend playing on Steam for one big reason I'll get to later. Trust me, there's no reason to pay out the ass for an overpriced PS2 copy these days. Not much of a concern though, even on PS2, are the visuals. The Steam version no doubt looks superior, but I played over HDMI for a nice result, which you're seeing now. Technically speaking that is. In terms of art direction and visual design, I'm not particularly impressed by Ark of Napishtim. It looks like another Ys game. Maybe it's the lack of sparkly effects or the muted color palette, but something about this one fails to pull me in as much as previous games did. Ys combat ain't exactly complicated, so I'd appreciate more splooshy boomy effects to keep my attention. Jeez, I sound like I'm talking out of my lizard brain here. But my point stands, the devs seem to have figured this out by Origin, so it's disappointing how Napishtim's not quite there. Before I go on, consider leaving a like, it really helps the channel reach more RPG fans, and subscribe for more videos like this. I mostly talk classic JRPGs, but nothing from the genre is off the table. Difficulty-wise, I've often heard Ys 6 called one of the harder games in the series. Oh, you're really gonna struggle during Napishtim, random forum goers would say. Those cats are insane. Napishtim's about on par for Ys, at least on normal mode, which I stick with for first playthroughs. I died way more times to bosses in Origin and Felghana, for one, while Ys 6 in comparison wasn't too bad. As always, your mileage may vary, grinding's always an option, and magic makes many fights a lot easier. If you're familiar with the way Origin and Felghana handled it, magic works much the same here, with 3 unlockable elemental-based options that recharge as you kill enemies, each building up to a massive AoE or ranged attack. In practice, it tends to be more effective to use them when you have them, rather than trying to plan out specific strats, since most bosses let you get up close and personal. A few of their patterns all but beg you to use a certain magic as their clear best strat, but for the most part, Ys 6 is more of the same hack-and-slash goodness. Beyond the fighting, for a PS2 game, there's not much else to the experience. Small maps, small world, not a ton of content, and while that's typical for Ys to some extent, Napishtim feels especially bare bones. It's hard to recommend to anyone but hardcore Ys fans who want to play every game, and for those of you who are, just don't go into it expecting a 40-hour experience like the series' most recent entries. If this one takes you longer than 15 hours or so, I'd worry there's something wrong with you. On top of that, I'm remiss to say that beyond the art design, the locations here feel uninspired. You'd think a story focused around a giant, unmoving hurricane that envelops a mysterious island chain could make for a fascinating fantasy setting. Yet instead, what we got feels like a retread of Oath and Felghana. Okay, you got me. Oath and Felghana came out after this game, so maybe I'd think differently had I played Napishtim first. But Nihon Falcom themselves recommend going through the series in numbered order, playing the latest remakes, and since that's what I'm doing, I can only be honest in saying, yeah, Ys was suffering from Mario Bros. Syndrome in the early aughts. It was starting to get too samey. Let's mix things up. Do we need yet another mountain environment, or another cavern with a waterfall somewhere? Another lava zone? Another quiet mining town? Heck, even the characterization lacks oomph. I didn't care about most of these characters nearly the same as how I got into the townsfolk of Ys 1, for example. That game's populace had more charm, pulling me in right away, whereas the denizens of East 6 feel like, well, NPCs. After thinking about it, I believe this might be because the game sticks with the formula of only one or two major towns, while making the mistake of not including enough interesting characters with personal quests to get into. At least that's one thing I loved about the first few East games. Aside from optional bosses mostly reserved for the endgame, I don't recall any side content in Napishtim. What a shame. Makes me wonder why these games lean so hard into their RPG mechanics like equipment, leveling, and crafting, while slacking on the storytelling aspect many fans like most about the genre. That's not to say this adventure's entirely without charm. The characters we do get are fine, just not quite as memorable as, say, Elena from Felghana or Rhea and Fina from 1, 2, and Origin. They all had a lot to do despite not featuring in their stories all that much, and I still remember their names. I doubt I'll be able to say the same about anyone in 6, even Geis, the game's enigmatic emo kid, or the prototype version of the Claw from Origin, in other words. He's on a generic, misunderstood anti-hero quest and could have saved everyone a lot of time and trouble if he'd just explained his motivations, but alas, Ys hadn't quite reached that level of storytelling by this point. The townsfolk fail to stand out. There's quite a few side quests that open up late in the game, but don't involve the characters much beyond them wanting you to fetch stuff. How fun. It was cool to see Rabba again, a sage from the first game who gets a slightly larger role here, though he ultimately don't get much to do besides look sagely. On the plus side, Napishtim does have voice acting in a few scenes, which impressed me enough, even though it can't stand up against many later era and even contemporary PS2 games. It doesn't help that the opening dialogue scenes got some cringe-as-hell lines from an allegedly badass pirate and guards who only managed to sound like dorks. Take a listen.
So you're the red-haired adult. The name's Ladok.
Come on, so you're the red-haired Adol? Any native speaker would sooner say, so you're that redhead, Adol, or possibly something with even fewer words. It's a lame, overly literal translation. Bad for a different reason than what the industry of today suffers from, but bad nonetheless. This is why we need localizers who care. Speaking of which, a funny quirk of the PS2 era shows up here, in how most NPCs in towns have multiple dialogue lines if you talk to them twice. Now, to any RPG fan that should sound great, but longtime JRPG fans, emphasis on the J, might see where I'm torn on this feature. Not all NPCs always have more than one thing to say, and there's no way of knowing whether they do. So, I end up talking to everyone twice and wasting my time on the 30% or so that don't say anything new. Let's just say I'm glad there's only a few towns in this game, and this problem has all but vanished in modern JRPGs, which have found ways to visually indicate when there's more to hear. I first saw this in the Tales games, you know, the little star or exclam beside NPCs with unread conversations. Love that. Everyone should copy it. Even Falcom knew they made one big mistake with the PS2 version though. No fast travel. Here it's especially painful since nearly every quest involves some sort of backtracking, and while the world ain't huge, it's big enough that I felt the tedium of this after a few hours. Thankfully, the later Steam version, which I recommended, lets you warp between save points like in Ys Origin, which, had I known that before playing, I might have sought out and saved myself at least a few hours. Still, Napishtim's on the short side even for an Ys game, so the backtracking, while frequent, ain't a huge deal. And that's all I've got to say about the combat and gameplay. Ark of Napishtim is an Ys game, a very average Ys game based on the action alone, which scores good enough marks to recommend to Ys fans, but for anyone else, there's better entry points to this storied series. Try Ys 1 and 2 Chronicles, or Ys Origin. Far more interesting, however, is Napishtim's story, or more specifically, the world building, which I'll give props to for the first time since Ys 2. With this entry, Falcom establishes a new overarching lore for the world of the series, introducing the legend of the Eldeen, an ancient race that spread their technology all over the planet. That's where all the Emelis come from. Those little shards Adol collects from enemies in most of the games were originally a power source for Eldeen devices. The ability to use and transmute Emelos into different colors with different powers is a closely guarded secret by the Eldeen and plays a major role in the backstory. In the land of Canaan, a people called the Reda once lived with an Eldeen named Alma whom they considered a god. But people are people, and soon some bad apples tried to attain the power of Emelos for themselves by messing with the titular Ark of Napishtim. That's a no-no, since this Ark, built by the Eldeen, acts as the planet's weather control system. Hey, that reminds me of Phantasy Star 2's plot. I'm recognizing more and more world-building tropes as I progress further on my JRPG journey. Anyway, screwing with the Ark causes the Black Calamity, which breaks apart the Redden people's homeland into the Canaan archipelago Adol gets to explore centuries later. To prevent this kind of disaster from happening again, Alma sinks the Ark and spawns a giant vortex that serves as the story hook. It's what shipwrecks Adol on the Canaan Islands in the first place. The legend of Alma, the Eldeen, and the history of the Redden people also tie into previous games, albeit in smaller ways than you might think, given how much some fans hype up Napishtim's world building. Spoiler alert, I guess, but this is Ys, not Kiseki. I haven't cared much about the happenings since Felghana, but if you do, skip ahead to the timestamp on screen. Fina and Rhea, the goddess-like winged sisters you had to work with in the first game, are actually Eldeen themselves. Surviving the Ark's destruction of their land, they, along with other Eldeen, founded the civilizations of the world and distantly relate to a few characters we've met in past games. That's about it though. It's the typical MO for world building in sequels. If you keep expanding further into the lore of the past, you don't need to move the story forward, right? I'm only half kidding. I get why people like this stuff, but the Ys games are so light on story, it's not like my mind was being constantly blown by any of these revelations. It was more like, oh, I guess I remember that character, or neat, that's how Fina got her wings. Now back to slicing shit up. Ys 6 offers tropey but adequate lore, which I am excited to see built upon over the next few games, or I assume that's where Falcom's heading anyway. I'm getting close to finishing the series myself. It's currently a race between Ys, Tales, Dragon Quest, and Final Fantasy as to which one I'll get caught up on first. The only problem is they keep releasing new ones, messing up all my plans. It's a good problem to have though. Anyway, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching. I've been Leon from RPG Haven. Leave a like for that algorithm, subscribe for more videos on RPGs of all kinds, let me know what you thought of Ys 6 in the comments, and have a blessed day.